Great. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our New Professionals Forum event as part of Farnborough Friday, Green Recovery. How can aerospace become sustainable? I'm Matt Hogston. I'm working for ADS at the moment, and I'm part of the New Professionals Forum committee. I've got my co-host, Hannah Falberg, with me. Hi, Hannah.
Hi, nice to meet you.
So Hannah is at Rolls-Royce, also part of the NPF committee. I've also got 5 panelists with me. So we've got Cristina Garcia-Duffy from the ATI. Hi, Cristina.
Hi, good morning.
I've got Sam Healy from QinetiQ. Hi, Sam.
Hello, good morning.
I've got Rachel Everard from Rolls-Royce. Hi, Rachel. I've got Keith Bushell from Airbus.
Hi.
And I've got Samir Savani from ADS.
Good morning, everybody.
Great. Now we're running our event using Slido today. You should see it in the Farnborough Connect portal. So there'll be a way to ask questions and also to interact live with polls. We should have got our first poll live now, looking at will COVID help or hinder decarbonisation and sustainability in aviation. So we'd love to hear your thoughts. So do get voting on that right now. And you'll be able to see that you'll be able to ask questions in there. We've got a live Q&A later. So do get firing away your questions. I just want to say this is run by the New Professionals Forum. We're a group, a network for new professionals in aerospace, defence, space and security industries. We're here to increase job satisfaction, inclusivity, and ultimately to grow and retain key skills in our industry. And we do this through things like innovation events like today. We have an annual conference, and we're also looking at building some networking events. Well, we all know that aerospace is going through a tough time at the moment. We've got this significant impact of COVID-19. There's an estimated 50 to 60% decline in world total passengers this year, which may mean that demand won't return for years. In fact, ADS estimate it'll be at least 2025 until narrow body airline demand returns, which will lead to an overcapacity of skills. So as a new professional in aerospace, you may be wondering, well, is aerospace still the right career to go down? And actually, what we want to show today is that there's a really bright future in aerospace, and that's because sustainability is going to be a key feature in the recovery that we have. So I'm going to hand over now to Hannah, who's going to talk a bit through the sustainability roadmaps.
Yeah, so one of the first things to think about is that we are a truly international industry. So anything that we do needs to be on both a local and a global level. So what you'll see on this slide is the CO2 impact and mitigation methods on a global scale. So this is produced by ATAG, which is an organisation that looks globally, and they're trying to attempt to get to 50% net zero by 2050 based on 2005 levels. So that red line there you'll see is the CO2 impact if we had done nothing. So what I want to really bring out here is the fact that we have always been improving the carbon footprint of our products. And that when we're talking about where we're going from today, we're talking about trying to move that blue line down. And you can see that big significance that we've had. But that blue line is more of a challenge to get to. And so what we're looking at are different levers. There's no silver bullet. There are different ways of doing so. And those things that are being brought out by ATAG are improvements in technology, improvement in operations. So how are we using our aircraft? Market-based measures, and sustainable aviation fuels, which were commonly known as SAFs. In the next slide, we'll be looking at what the UK specifically is talking around. So this is by Sustainable Aviation, of which a couple of people here, including myself, are a member of. And they are looking at getting to net zero by 2050. So that's zero carbon emitted from aviation. And again, you see the similar themes coming out there, looking at the way that it can be improved through technology, the way we can improve it through operations, the way we can improve it through market-based measures, and again through SAFs. So really thinking about how individuals listening to this can help move all of those metrics. And you'll be listening today to some experts in the field. Each one will be looking at different levers and mechanisms to get to decarbonisation in a bit more detail. Hopefully inspire you to see how you can help continue this on, because by 2050, the people listening to this call will be the leaders and need to follow the trailblazers that you'll be listening to today. So we'll be listening initially about technology from ATI with Cristina. Then we'll be moving on to the operations side with ADS and Samir. We'll then look on market-based measures, which is a bit of a catch-all for a lot of things, and that will be Rachel from Rolls-Royce. And then finally looking at SAFs from the perspective of Airbus. And then just because there's a mixture, this is just civil, we'll be looking at the influences of sustainability in defence through Sam from QinetiQ. So I'm going to start with passing over to Cristina, now looking at technologies. Cristina.
Thank you, Hannah. I'll just give you a 20-second overview of who we are. We are the UK Aerospace Technology Institute. We're a partnership between the UK government and UK industrial organisations. We've been around since 2014, and we lead in generating the strategy for UK aerospace technology. We then deliver the strategy by working with industry, academia, and research organisations. We've so far launched about 305 projects, and we keep going strong despite COVID. We still have a lot of interest from companies in innovating, so we'll keep doing our best. I just want to show you the top level areas of the strategy on the next slide, so that you understand. As Hannah said, Matt, if you don't mind changing the slide, thank you. As Hannah said, we have a civil aerospace remit, and we look mostly at technologies on aircraft. Our latest strategy was released in November 2019, so just this past November, and our key aims for air transport were to have a sustainable air transport that enables mobility, so all of these urban air vehicles are coming into the market in the next few years and decades, while maintaining competitiveness. The UK has had a track record of good competitiveness. That is why we're high on aerospace in comparison to other countries in the world. We have programs that address whole aircraft, and our agenda is to provide technologies for future sustainable vehicles in the future. And we do this by enabling technology development for propulsion, systems, and structures. If we move on to the next slide. So don't be scared by the graph. I know it's very busy. I don't intend to go into much detail. This is our market outlook. And these are the aircraft that we see could potentially come into the market from now, 2020, all the way to 2040 plus. Usually market outlooks are made for 10 years for rotorcraft, about 20 years for fixed wing. You can see at the top the large commercial air vehicles, which are the wide body and the narrow body. In terms of technologies, for propulsion, there's a big drive for improving ultra-high bypass ratio engines. And on structures, there's a lot of work going around improving the wings of aircraft and on the systems, updating the system. Towards 2040 plus, you can see by some of the images that the architectures of the aircraft change at whole aircraft. We can see there one where the propulsion system is more embedded into the airframe of the aircraft, and later on we could see potentially People call them blended wing bodies or flying wings. You can see there at the right one of the NASA prototype. So very exciting opportunities in these large commercial aircraft segments with lots of new technologies, and we're just keeping pushing the boundaries. Business jets on the next line offer a great opportunity to test technologies at an early stage. Cost is not such a barrier in this type of aircraft, so they're usually quite amenable to incorporating new technologies that get tested and then get incorporated into the large commercial passenger aircraft. So we will have some opportunities in the next 20 years or so to do this. Going down to the regional side of the market, we have new models coming in. I guess from this perspective, the most pushing technologies are around propulsion and power. Hybrid electric aircraft, these mean aircraft that are powered by either a conventional jet or propellers that are driven hybridly with either sustainable aviation fuels or traditional kerosene, and a combination with electric energy storage solutions. Could be batteries or could be fuel cells powered by hydrogen. The jury is out there for these type of aircraft. There's lots of new different architectures for them, but we see new potential architectures coming on the jet side of things, or as you can see there on the right, sort of distributed propulsion, which takes advantage of augmented lift, improving aerodynamic performance of the aircraft, where you have distributed propellers, which are very much enabled by a more electric system. And then we have the shorter range, lower number of passengers side of the market with sub-regional and urban. Again, many different configurations and exciting opportunities coming in. There's lots of startup companies looking at the urban, personal passenger vehicles, air taxi, vehicles for delivering goods with very different radical configurations. For those we see, for them to be able to get into the market, they should be net zero carbon from the get-go, with the aim of achieving zero absolute carbon in future. But again, lots of exciting opportunities. On the left, I will just point you towards the alternative sustainable energy sources. Keith Bushell from Airbus will talk to you later about sustainable aviation fuel, which will be key for us achieving our targets on net zero carbon for aircraft by 2050. And there's also use of other electrification technologies such as batteries and hydrogen-powered fuel cells. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Cristina. And that's a really useful overview of how technology is being used for this. Just a reminder before we move on to Samir, through Slido, you are able to submit questions for Cristina and the rest of the panelists that will be answered and be going through the Q&A sessions and help inform what questions you would like answered. So, Samir, please, can you talk to us about how operations can help build upon the sustainability efforts of aviation?
Thanks, Hannah. Matt, if we can move on to the first slide, please. So, yeah, it's worth just flashing up the decarbonisation roadmap from sustainable aviation that Hannah flashed up earlier. And just to say, despite the improvement in operations, and by operations we mean the way we fly aircraft, both in the air and the way they operate on the ground in terminal areas. Although it's quite a small gain compared to the other parts of the roadmap, somewhere between 4 and 5% in terms of what we're doing in the UK. It is absolutely important that we sweat this particular area and make sure we decarbonize as much as we can, both from an environmental perspective, but also from a cost perspective for airlines and operators. So it really is an important part, but a much smaller wedge of the roadmap than the other areas. Next slide, please, Matt. So in terms of what we can gain from operations, an EASA study that was published a couple of years ago suggests that about 6% of CO2 could be gained in terms of the operational improvements between what we see today in terms of gate flight operations versus what we call unimpeded trajectories. Now, for various reasons, it's not possible to get all of those gains, but you can see there are still some gains to be had. Even in recent years, through the introduction of what's called free route airspace in Europe, that's saved 2.6 million tons of CO2 since 2014. So you can see some pretty large numbers in terms of carbon gains that are possible. As I mentioned before, although the excess CO2 from operational inefficiencies is small, it has to be a part of our relentless pursuit for sustainability, especially to accommodate future growth. And you have to remember, even with the gains that we've gained so far from operational improvements, that's been in lockstep with the growth in aviation all around the world, but particularly in Europe from these figures. So while aviation has been growing, we've actually been able to cut the carbon footprint from operations in absolute terms. So there are a raft of ways in which that can happen, particularly around the aircraft operation while they're in flight. Through approaches like continuous climb and descent approaches, and you can kind of see an illustration of what we mean by that. And already millions of tons of CO2 have been saved. But on top of those kind of bigger gains within operations, all of the smaller gains can start to add up. So that's having different and innovative arrival and departure management techniques, time-based separation for final approaches on flights arriving in and out of terminals, and also the way aircraft are moving on the ground. So surface movement planning can all add up to gains. Next slide, please. And just to illustrate some examples of what en route gains can be, these are studies done by Eurocontrol over a 2-week period. And if we look at just 3 examples of where we might see some gains, so if we look at London to Geneva, actually it's quite an efficient route, but during this 2-week period, you would have seen the French air traffic control strike, and you can see what that's done to routes, and that's created around about 30% extra distance and time, and therefore fuel burn and carbon during that period. And these are things that are avoidable in future. If we look at another route, that's the Paris to Nice, we can see it's quite a nice route. It's flown quite efficiently, except that there are deviations depending on whether you're taking the north-south or the south-north route. And again, these are things that can be improved. And what isn't shown on this slide is actually 90% of the excess distance that is flown on these routes takes place in the terminal areas. So things like stacking can really add up. Again, these are things that are avoidable with future technology. And then if we look at a particular airspace architecture issue in the UK, so if we look at the Birmingham to Copenhagen route, this isn't a particularly densely flown route, but you can start to see it's one of the lowest efficiency routes in Europe in terms of the distance versus the straight line or the Great Circle distance. And that's because flights have to avoid military zones in the UK or have very specific entry points into UK airspace. Again, these are things we can improve on vastly to make sure those operational efficiencies are coming through. They're relatively simple to do in technical terms, but actually take quite a lot of effort in terms of collaboration with different airspace owners and users and operators. That's really all I wanted to say around operations, a small but important part of the sustainability improvement journey. Thanks, Anna.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks for that, Samir. And then building upon that, we're talking to Rachel Everard next on market-based measures. Again, keep your questions coming through on the Slido. They're all looking great. But yeah, let's pass over to Rachel.
Thanks, Hannah. So I think, next slide, please. I just want today to give you a bit of an introduction to what market-based measures are and what they can potentially contribute to decarbonising aviation. I think if you think back to that sustainable aviation roadmap that both Hannah and Samir flashed up, we saw that market-based measures broadly are looking at around about a third contribution to the net zero carbon by 2050 goal that sustainable aviation has set for the UK industry. So they do have a really important role to play. When we think about market-based measures, or MBMs as they're often shortened to, I think it's worth defining them as kind of a deliberate intervention that is desired, can bring about a desired change. It's pretty broad. They can be a number of different things. And one that you might have come across outside of aviation is things like the sugar tax here in the UK. So if you want to go and buy a fizzy drink and you want to buy a Coca-Cola, it is more expensive than if you want to buy a Diet Coke. And the aim of that is to, through the market, through making it more expensive, to incentivize people to choose the healthier option to reduce your sugar intake. So, sorry, next slide, please. Thanks, Matt. A couple of kind of examples or categories of market-based measures, and I've kind of broken them down here into three broad categories that I want to talk about today. The first one is policy interventions, so something that drives or kind of can mandate a certain behaviour where that behaviour might not normally come about because quite typically it's more expensive. An example of this within aviation might be something like the use of a mandate that says that you must use a certain percentage of sustainable aviation fuel in your fuel mix. That as sustainable aviation fuel, SAF, is more expensive typically than kerosene, by introducing a mandate, it can kind of help stimulate that market and kind of require airlines to use a fuel that they might not otherwise do because it is more expensive. The second one is around carbon taxing and prices. So here you would assign a fixed price, usually a kind of dollar per tonne or pound per tonne on carbon emissions as part of a tax or as part of a kind of cap and trade system where you would set a limit that says that you as a single entity can emit this much carbon, and if you go above that limit, you have to pay for extra credits. So that's something that we see in the EU through the EU emissions trading scheme. It doesn't currently apply for aviation, but there are kind of calls to expand its scope to include aviation, and similarly whatever version of the kind of UK carbon pricing that they will put in place after kind of Brexit, again calls for that to include aviation's emissions. And finally, and this is probably the one that people kind of default first to when we talk about market-based measures, but actually it's perhaps best considered as an interim and as a kind of last resort, is offsetting. So here where you look to invest in or pay to reduce or remove emissions that aren't within your own control because there's nothing you can do about the emissions that you have, or you've kind of exhausted all options. So instead you might choose to offset. Examples here would include investing in environmental projects, usually overseas. There aren't actually any available offsetting schemes here in the UK. And what you're really looking to do here when you offset is to invest in a scheme where you can sink carbon, but also has additional socio-economic and environmental impacts as well, kind of creating a more robust and credible offsetting programme. Sorry, next slide, please, Matt. So from those kind of three broad categories, I think something that's worth bearing in mind is that there's some kind of common principles that we might want to consider when we look at the role of market-based measures in decarbonising aviation. I think first and foremost, the crux of the challenge here is that reaching net zero carbon emissions by 2050 is a big challenge, and it's also very expensive. The technology levers that Cristina talked about, whether it's sustainable aviation fuels, it's advancing engine efficiency, or it's disruptive new propulsion systems, are all going to be very expensive to bring to market. And they're also going to require this kind of systems level transformation. Aviation itself is already a very expensive sector. And I think market-based measures can play a really important role in kind of helping to support the cost and the R&D expenditure involved with these technology advancements, but also to stabilise the market as we go through those transitions. And those transitions we all recognise are absolutely necessary. I think one thing we do also need to consider is looking at that market stability is, as Hannah said right at the start, that aviation is intrinsically a global industry. We want to avoid kind of variety and variances in economic measures in particular, primarily because that can lead to carbon leakage. If you've got a a tax that only applies in a certain region or a certain location, you may drive the wrong behaviours, in that you may drive people to choose to fly somewhere else because they don't want to pay that charge, and that doesn't actually address the carbon issue that we're trying to address here. Also, I think there is a danger that market-based measures are dismissed as being kind of not really kind of tackling the crux of the challenge, but I think we do need to consider them to be quite necessary in helping with this transition, helping to kind of decarbonise aviation in a way that means that we're not compromising the levels of connectivity, comfort and affordability that we appreciate about our global aviation industry today, as we look to make sure that that industry is compatible with a net zero carbon future. Next slide, please, Matt. I just wanted to talk very quickly about some of the market-based measures that are being used in aviation today. So firstly is Corsia, and I'll come on to that in a bit more detail, but that's something you might have heard about quite a lot. It's something that's quite well known about the aviation industry in terms of a global offsetting programme. Other airlines have then gone a step forward, or step beyond that, and introduced their own voluntary offsetting schemes, British Airways and EasyJet, both here in the UK. There's also the role of kind of R&D subsidies and air passenger duties, actually, interestingly, not necessarily intended to be an environmental measure, but has kind of morphed into that over time. And then, like I said before, the use of kind of specific SAF blend mandates. Scandinavia is quite a well-known example of that. Sorry, next slide, please. And when we think about kind of what potential market-based measures could be explored or have been proposed or maybe need to be proposed in the future, I think looking at things like the expansion of SAF blend mandates is quite an interesting area, help to stimulate what it could be what will be a very expensive transition, a very expensive market. Like I mentioned before, the expansion of the EU ETS into aviation. It's been proposed that we could also look at things like frequent flyer levies, where there's additional taxes for those that choose to fly more frequently. And also I think something to consider is the role of global carbon pricing and how that could help to accelerate change within aviation. And so almost final slide. So it's a really complicated topic. I could talk about this for a while. It's just to touch quickly on the Corsia programme. So this is something that was adopted by ICAO back in 2016, and it's the only actually global carbon offsetting and reduction scheme. And I think what's quite interesting about this is that it sets a requirement that international aviation will offset any growth in carbon emissions through what is going to be an approved suite of projects that will be governed by ICAO. This is actually expected to potentially offset, this is pre-COVID, I must admit, but up to 2.6 billion tonnes of CO2 globally throughout its life. So that's a pretty substantial commitment. Worth noting that for the first few years, this is voluntary. It doesn't become mandatory until 2027 and expires by 2035. But what it is an interesting example, I think, of the aviation industry collectively agreeing a programme that can help to kind of act as an interim measure to help to meet that decarbonisation challenge. And sorry, I think this is my final slide. Next up, sorry, that's what I meant. Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of summarise by just reiterating, I think, that a market-based measure is that deliberate intervention to bring about a change. That I think they can be really useful in helping to accelerate change and accelerate decarbonisation within aviation, and particularly where the cost of that change is extremely high. Something that we do need to be mindful of is that we are applying market-based measures in a way that can drive the right behaviours and drive the change that we are looking for, and that also that finance is kind of retained within the sector and is used to help to accelerate that technology transition rather than lost into programmes like offsetting. Thank you. Sorry, that was a lot in slightly more than 5 minutes. Apologies.
No, don't apologise. It was all very interesting, and as you said, it's a very large topic. You could talk about it for ages, and we've only got a couple of minutes here. If you're interested in any of the levers that we're discussing here and you want to talk to our specialists in more detail, they will be in breakout rooms at the end of the Q&A. But we're just going to move on now to another very large topic, which are sustainable aviation fuels. So we can pass over to Keith Bushell from Airbus. Please keep your questions coming in over Slido.
Good morning, everyone. If we can move on to the next slide. So this is the UK Sustainable Aviation Decarbonisation Roadmap, which has been mentioned on a number of occasions. This is the 4th iteration of the roadmap, first one in 2010. And I think the most important thing to say when it comes to sustainable fuels is that they are crucial to the decarbonisation of the industry. We've, over the years, been working quite heavily on sustainable fuels. And the prediction, or the estimation, the work that we've done with regarding this roadmap is to say that by 2050, we can achieve around 14.4 million tonnes of carbon avoided. So this will be life cycle carbon. So on this graph, perhaps I ought to say on this graph, that the actual wedge, which is for sustainable fuels, is the orangey yellowy colour, which is 14.4 million tonnes of avoided carbon. Now that carbon is life cycle carbon, so it's important to from the start. Above the orange, above the yellowy orange wedge, are carbon which has been avoided, and the carbon which we are saving here for sustainable fuels is life cycle saving. The other thing to say is that not all biofuels are sustainable aviation fuels, and not all sustainable aviation fuels are biofuels, which is why we're very focused on the word sustainable aviation fuels. As an industry, we're committed to sustainability. There's lots of different ways in which you can produce a fuel. Some of them are sustainable and some of them aren't sustainable. And so it's important that we focus on the sustainability aspect of these fuels. Next slide, please. So this slide is showing you that over the last decade, there's a number of new pathways which have been certified for the use in aviation. When it comes to the use of alternative fuels, sustainable aviation fuels, the most important, the most critical factor as an airspace manufacturer is the fact that they are safe. So the whole certification process is focused on safety. As you can see, that there's around 7 pathways which have been certified, and then we also have 2 new ones, 2 co-processing, Fischer-Tropsch and Heifer, which I've gone through what's called a fast track process, which means that you can use a 5% blend. Each of these fuels needs to be blended with fossil kerosene at different levels, and the blending ratio is on the right hand side. And at the moment, the current maximum blend is at 50%. And this is a safety concern. Now, as manufacturers, we are looking to push that envelope. There's lots of research work going on to understand what the capabilities of our engines, airframes are regarding the percentage of sustainable fuel. And we anticipate that there will be the opportunity to move to 100% blends, but that is still work in progress. I think the other thing to say is that it takes quite a while for these fuels to go through certification. It's extremely important that we understand all the capabilities of the fuel to ensure that they are safe. So typically a fuel will take 3 to 5 years to get through the certification process, and that's something that we want to try and accelerate, which is why we have the fast track process. Okay, next slide, please. Now, in the UK, in order to understand the opportunity that we have for sustainable fuels, Sustainable Aviation produced their first Sustainable Aviation Fuels roadmap in 2014, and now this is the 2020 version. And this was very much the data which was gathered by E4Tech. So E4Tech were the independent consultant that did the work to understand the opportunities that we have for sustainable fuels in the UK. And as you can see from this infographic, that by 2035, we're anticipating that we can generate £2.7 billion worth of total gross added value to the UK, up to 14 operational plants, which will create 5,200 jobs, and also a much bigger number of jobs within the supply chain, 13,600. So the opportunity for us in the UK to produce sustainable fuels is great, but we need to have the right policy mechanisms, we need to have the right incentives, The biggest challenge that we have, as you saw from the previous slide, there are a number of pathways which have already been certified. Each of those pathways are a drop-in fuel, which means that they can be used in current airframes and engines. So there's no technical barrier to use of these fuels. The barriers are very much about scale up and supply of the fuels, and ensuring that we do have the right policy mechanism to incentivize that scale up. Next slide, please. So what's Airbus doing? Airbus is the biggest manufacturer of aviation and aircraft in the world. And we've been involved in sustainable fuels right from the start. In fact, in 2008, I think we did the first demonstration flight using an alternative fuel, which was a liquid gas, and that was done in 2008. So we've been at this for about 12 or more years. We see it as extremely important within our strategy for the sustainable development of the industry. We as an industry, we need a license to grow, we need a license to operate. We understand the impacts that the industry as a whole has on environment. We want to protect that environment for humanity. And so we've been engaged in sustainable fuels, as I said, for 12 plus years. And there's lots of key areas in which we are involved. Engagement with airlines and other partners on policy, incentivization, encouraging and working at ICAO level, working with ATAG and all the industry organizations to get the right policies in place so the industry can grow. Our number one role within the whole development of the industry is through certification. It is paramount for us as a manufacturer that these fuels are safe. And also, we're also heavily involved with looking at the life cycle analysis of these fuels, understanding their sustainability criteria. As I said, not all fuels are sustainable and not all sustainable fuels are biofuels. So there's lots of different opportunities when it comes to which fuels you're going to use. We've been involved in innovation and research. So we're talking about drop-in fuels, but then there's the opportunity for what are called non-drop-in fuels, fuels which are alternative propulsion technologies and alternative fuels which are not kerosene. And so there's a lot of research work going on things like hydrogen, power to liquid, which actually will be a drop-in fuel, but new technology development in order to find out new ways in which we can have greater propulsion, greater opportunities to decarbonize the industry. And we're working very closely with different partners, whether it be fuel producers, airlines, airports, and other operators when it comes to sustainable fuels. Next slide, please. And one of the key things that we have been able to achieve over the last 4 or 5 years is that we have been able to offer sustainable fuels for all of our customers. So every customer of Airbus has the opportunity to use sustainable fuels on their delivery flights. We started in Toulouse with the first flights there, then went to Mobile, Alabama in the US, the delivery flights there, and currently we've also been able to achieve delivery flights from Hamburg. So the opportunity for any customer to have their aircraft delivered using sustainable aviation fuels. But also internally within Airbus, we use the Beluga. We've got the new Beluga XL, which perhaps some of you have seen, which is amazing, taking various parts of the aircraft around the world to the final assembly lines. And we're now using sustainable aviation fuels on those Beluga flights. We're also looking at other internal flights, such as aircraft testing that we're doing on the aircraft, and we're looking at using sustainable fuels there. So when it comes to sustainable fuels, we're really keen to push the industry forward and do our part, make sure that our operations are sustainable too. Next slide, please. I think that's the last one. But just to sum up, I think that sustainable aviation fuels are crucial to the development of a sustainable aviation industry. It's now technology. It's now technology that we can use now to decarbonize. We're going to need sustainable fuels for the long term because we haven't got an alternative for long haul flight. And in the short to medium term to decarbonize, the shorter range aircraft as well. But we need innovation, we need incentives, we need policy, and by that we need scale up, and then we'll be able to use those fuels at a greater extent. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. I think that's also a really good demonstration of how these levers are not necessarily independent from one another, particularly talking around things like market-based measures, influences on SAF uptake. So we've got a number of questions coming through. Keep them coming. We've got the Q&A coming up. I'm going to wrap up the deep dive session by talking to Sam from QinetiQ about the similarities and differences in defence and how sustainability applies to the defence sector. So Sam, over to you.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. So I'm a Director of Corporate Responsibility and Sustainability at QinetiQ, but I'm also Chair of the ADS Environmental Sustainability Working Group. And this is where we bring people, sustainability professionals from across the sectors, from aerospace and defence together to learn, to collaborate, to drive this sustainability agenda. And we're considering sustainability in that sort of broader sense. Environmental issues are a cornerstone. We look at those wider issues because each area of the sector will have different priorities. And we collaborate with a number of other groups as well. So obviously the Sustainable Aviation Board. And I think what's key is we welcome that diversity of thinking. So it's about bringing together sort of large and small companies, different aspects of the supply chain, different aspects of the value chain as well. So we think about the defence sector in particular. I mean, I've been in defence my whole career. I've been involved in environmental sustainability issues for over 20 years. And I've seen that real evolution and steady change in the drivers and this growing focus. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has only sharpened that focus on the importance of understanding climate change and societal issues. And so there's some key initiatives that are going on in defence at the moment, which I think are particular drivers. Firstly is the development of a new climate change strategy within the Ministry of Defence, but also some new ways of driving public procurement through government, through social value. And these underpin that wider government drive for net zero and building up better and green recovery. And so there's this role for industry, both to be a responsible business and really take their, play their part in dealing with these challenges, but also to achieve their own levels of resilience and efficiency. So some recent work by Fidelity has shown that those businesses that take sustainability seriously have been more resilient during COVID-19, which I think is really important. And I think when we think about climate change, so often we're thinking about, what is our impact? How can we mitigate? How can we reduce the impacts? But I think it's also important to understand the really potential and profound impact that climate change will have on our sector and the world more broadly. And there's been some absolutely fantastic research, most recently by RAND, looking at the impact of climate change on defence operations. And this builds on some work by DCDC around some of those sort of forecasting and wider issues. And I think what is clear is that we say the UN Security Council has been talking specifically about how climate change is one of the most urgent challenges for the maintenance of international security. And I think it's that recognition that as climate change manifests, there'll be population displacements triggered by sea level and coastal regions and droughts and resource shortages. And so there's a real need for the defence industry and to look at the role of defence, the skills that we need. And I know that Matt touched on skills at the start of this session, is our ability to adapt to this change, how it affects people as they operate in these different environments. Importantly, how it affects equipment. Will the equipment that we have now be able to operate in these different environments, both the different deployments that are required, but also the different environments that are likely to happen, and also the resilience of the supply chain. In parallel, there's some issues going on within the corporate sector around investors really scrutinising how business are preparing themselves and understanding the impact of climate change. This programme's run by the Task Force of Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, so it's quite a long title. And it's really about recognising that we need to take this seriously, both for the impact of the physical impacts of climate change, but also how does industry adapt to decarbonisation? So as the whole of the UK and beyond decarbonise, what impact will that have on our business? So if I touch on a new initiative within the MOD around a climate change strategy, The MOD has about 50% of government's carbon emissions, so clearly it's important that this particular part of government is taking this seriously, and a really big part of their spend is with industry. So we've got a critical role there, and I think there's some really exciting conversations that are starting to happen about what we can do collectively to drive and support this strategy. How do we make equipment more modular so that we can rapidly adapt and change and look at how we move new and exciting technology forward? How do we develop things like synthetic training? So how do we optimize synthetic things and tap into some of the advances in VR? How do we create sustainability dossiers so we understand the equipment? And how do we look at alternatives to deliver the mission? So what is the role of unmanned vehicles as part of those aspects? And there were some trials last month very specifically to look at teaming between helicopters and drones, because that stuff is enormously complex. There are really big safety issues, and those first trials in the UK are really promising to look at how do you enhance the mission, how do you enhance capability? And I think those what's then really key when we look at these just enormous challenges that we're facing is how do we work together, how do we collaborate? So ADS is bringing together some of the key organisations across the UK to tackle some of these issues and just tap into what's going on to drive the change. And I think some of this is around, you know, really truly understanding sustainability across the full life cycle. So as we create it, test it, use it, dispose of it, how are we thinking about sustainability? How are we thinking about both the role of engineers and scientists to really develop those key engineering solutions, but actually more broadly, how do we drive sustainability into all aspects of business? How do we drive it into finance and commercial so that actually sustainability becomes a mindset and it's embedded throughout everything that we do? So sustainability isn't an add-on, it isn't a nice to have, it's truly embedded through everything we do, which is when we'll start to really see the shift. And then finally, it's across the whole ecosystem of defence. So you're hearing today from some of the larger organisations, but the defence and the aerospace sector has a huge number of smaller businesses who are vital to the ecosystem. How do we ensure that they're able to deliver on the sustainability journey as well? So I think just that final point around the absolute vital element of collaboration, and I know the other speakers have touched on this, is how we're working together to solve some of these absolutely enormous challenges. Thank you.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Sam. And it's really great to hear it from a different angle, because personally, I hear quite a lot around the commercial side. So seeing the defence side is really refreshing. So we're going to move on now to the Q&A. We're just going to put a bit of a reminder of who's who in the zoo. And I'm going to open up. We're going to be starting looking at the response to the poll that we did at the start and getting some of your opinions on that before we move on to the audience questions that they've been submitting through Slido whilst you've been speaking. So the first question I'd like to direct to the whole panel, whoever would like to pick this one up first, is are you surprised or not surprised by the audience response of thinking that COVID will help the sustainability agenda? By 73% of people said that they think it will help the agenda, which is quite a large majority. So who would like to answer that one first?
Shall I go first?
Yeah.
So I think I'm not that surprised with that figure. We've had a number of announcements of airlines who are going to be grounding some of the noisiest, most polluting aircraft and not going to be flying them again. It's going to take a long time for the industry to recover. And I think it's quite clear from public opinion that we have to improve our sustainability criteria, improve our sustainability credentials. But I think some of these latest retirements actually are going to drive that agenda going forward, that we're going to be looking at a lot more different types of technology, and it's going to accelerate some of the improvements.
Yeah, thank you.
I'd agree with what Keith has just said. I think one thing that has come out of this COVID crisis essentially is that kind of recognition, I suppose, of the fragility of unsustainable systems. And I think it gives us a bit of an opportunity as well for a bit of a reset. I think you look at what is predicted in terms of global CO2 emissions and the reduction that's predicted throughout 2020 as a result of the essentially kind of economic and industrial lockdown that has persisted globally over the last couple of months, not just here in the UK, but around the world. And we're only seeing that will only reduce somewhere between 5 and 8% of global CO2 emissions for 2020. That is in line with the same trajectory that the IPC are telling us we have to reach every year to get to net zero carbon by 2050. And I think that highlights for us as a sector that you can, if you essentially ground aviation and you look at the significant socio-economic impacts of that and the disruption that has caused to day-to-day lives around the world, I think it's just, it's that opportunity to kind of reset and have a fresh start and say, okay, so this has really invigorated the industry to recognise that as we come back, we do need to build back better, and we need to be putting green recovery front and centre of how we think about aviation going forward and how we get flying again.
Interesting, thank you. I'm going to go over to the questions that have been coming in online now and be a bit more targeted in who we're talking to at this point. But they've been voting on them as well, so these I'm going to go through the most popular ones first. So Cristina, this one is for you. When we're talking around sustainability in aerospace, how are we factoring in things like the whole product life cycle, the cradle to grave, and things like that for it? So is it just exhaust emissions, or are we thinking about sustainability on more of a whole product life cycle assessment? Have we got Cristina on the line?
Yep, I think she's just muted.
Yeah, so very much on the life cycle. We are measured by governments on tailpipe emissions, and that's not just carbon emissions, but carbon is most urgent now because it's a great challenge that the sector are facing. But we very much look at life cycle emissions, and they don't only include carbon. We look at nitrogen oxides. We look at particulate matter and local air quality at airports. Noise is a big part of our portfolio. So we look at that life cycle sustainability. The ATI strategy has a framework for sustainability, which includes a more energy efficient aircraft, but it also includes improvement on aircraft ground and air operations, the adoption and exploitation of alternative energy sources like we've seen today. There's also a lot in our portfolio of work, and there's a big drive on more sustainable manufacturing processes that require less energy consumption, that do less waste of materials. So technologies like near net shape, for example, which reduce the amount of wasted material in your manufacturing process. And we also look at more sustainable through life engineering services. So maintenance, repair and overhaul activities, how understanding data from when aircraft are flying can feed into the design process, so that we design aircraft that have better recycling capabilities, things like that. So it's very much on a life cycle, cradle to grave assessment that we look at sustainability.
Yeah, it's very similar to what Sam was saying at the end in her session, where she's talking around that connectivity and how it's the collaboration that's required through all of the supply chain and all of that side of things. It seems quite a lot of cultural change that will be required for that. So Sam, I was wondering whether you can share any light around how the cultural changes and lessons being learnt through Tempest are they similar, are they different, and can be applied to the sustainability angle?
I think there's a real key to that collaboration of bringing people together. And I think if we touch on COVID and look at sort of the cultural shocks about how we recognise that we can adapt really quickly, I think that sector piece around how do we work, how do we collaborate together, how do we look at the whole ecosystem is absolutely key. And I know COVID has really shone a spotlight on how it's possible for us to change really, really rapidly. And I think that's a really helpful reminder to all of us that we can innovate and change quite quickly. But I'm certainly seeing that appetite from across industry to bring that broader perspective to bear outside.
Mm-hmm. And we're talking around this in a global sense, but obviously we've had Brexit in the UK as well, and we'll be leaving EASA around that. And so, Keith, how does that impact the certification of SAF fuels and impact the ability for the UK to be a leader in this market?
It's a very interesting question. I don't think it's going to have a significant impact when it comes to the certification of fuels, because it's a global certification standard. And so there are fuels which are certified, which don't go through ASTM already. And we also have our own standard in the UK, DEF Stand 9191. So when it comes to the certification of fuels, I don't think there's going to be any impact when it comes to Brexit and leaving EASA. But I do think obviously that it's something that we'll need to keep an eye on and understand if there's any further impacts which we haven't anticipated.
Mm-hmm. And do you see there being any impacts to the way airlines have to operate and use their aircraft to be able to satisfy these fuels? I guess that's a question to both Keith and Samir here as the operations side.
So, oh, sorry, go on, Samir.
No, go on. So the fuels we're talking about are generally drop-in fuels. So they take little or no adaptation of the aircraft, and that's really the kind of long-term journey. At the moment, the kind of waste to fuels, but as that waste feedstock starts to run out, both in absolute terms, but also relative terms, as the market for SAFs pick up, we're going to have to think about next generation of fuels, power to liquids, kind of technology in terms of those fuels. But by and large, particularly for the long range end, they will always have to be drop-in fuels. So there isn't probably much to do around changing on the operations. I guess the change will come if hydrogen as a combustion fuel is seen as the future. Then that does take quite a lot of change in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of transportation of fuels, fuel systems that you might provide at airports, and how do you get the fuel there and how do you store it. But if it is going to be sustainable aviation fuels, by and large, we mean drop-in solutions, which, as they kind of say on the tin, operate within the existing aircraft as well as the airport infrastructure framework.
Yeah, really interesting. It seems like this, all of these topics seem to have a large impact on the airlines, and particularly market-based measures is one of those that maybe will be addressed to the airlines first. So, Rachel, do you have any kind of feedback from the airlines on their opinions to market-based measures?
I think that's a good question. I think it's difficult to say because there's so much variety in what market-based measures can deliver. And I think, as I set out, that variety means that there's a lot of opportunity, but there's also a lot of kind of variances in terms of what might be applied and what might not be. I think if you look at what market-based measures are in existence today, Corsia has been very well received across the international aviation sector and by the airlines in particular. I think as we look to how we can evolve that market, you might see more change. I don't know at this stage.
So could I also add that I think it's really important to say that what we don't really want as an industry is a patchwork of different measures. We want one global measure that is applicable across every continent to ensure that we don't get carbon leakage, we don't get competitive distortions, we don't end up with bad offsetting, and so on. There's lots and lots of different reasons why we want a single mechanism. Corsia is that mechanism. What we're saying is the global mechanism that we're focused on. We see it as something which is equal. There's a huge amount of work going on at ICAO and through the states to ensure that we reduce any competitive disadvantages, and also the opportunity for the newest, most immature countries stroke airlines to be able to continue to grow without any disadvantage. So there's a huge amount of work gone into Corsia and the development of it and the negotiation of it, that it's really important that everyone gets behind it.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And there's even one of the people on the line has shown, how do we ensure that we don't go down a car route where market-based measures force people to kind of adopt more diesel, and then later down the road that opinion's been switched and diesels have been impacted quite harshly on it. So how do we ensure that aviation doesn't push a measure that then later down the road you have to backtrack on?
I think that in particular is a really important question, and it broadens the topic of sustainability to be much more than the climate change debate. So while we at the moment fixated on, I guess, net zero carbon, that's the UK target, and that's what everyone's rallying around, that sustainability agenda is much broader, and that's what makes aerospace particularly complex. If we take just one example, batteries, for example, how sustainable are batteries, because they've got some pretty nasty minerals and chemicals in them, cobalt, lithium, and the way those are mined and through life and then recycled. Those are all part of the sustainability agenda. And then simple things like, how are those batteries being recharged? Is it through a sustainable electricity source? And therefore that's about making the national grid sustainable. So these are really complex interrelated challenges, which aerospace engineers are perfectly well positioned to help tackle. But we have to acknowledge that this isn't a silver bullet solution. We have to kind of embrace the complexity of that challenge if we're going to tackle it. Otherwise, things we do in particular parts, for example, batrification, could have a detrimental aspect in other parts of the sustainability agenda. So looking at it holistically as a complex system of systems isn't something we should shy away from, but we should actually embrace and apply the brightest engineers to those challenges.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. So just focusing on some of the last question or so, focusing to Cristina, building upon that and that influx of electrification and the impact that will have on sustainability, you raised up around urban mobility, and that will cause some great behaviour changes. One of the questions that came up is around, how do we get onto a point where there are smaller airports being protected and changing that operational landscape where the infrastructure is required and the smaller airports are required to enable this technology to come to the market?
So if we look at a UK level, the airport infrastructure is there. There are many underused local airports currently in the network. Looking at a global level, it depends on the type of aircraft, if it's a conventional takeoff and landing aircraft or if it's a vertical takeoff and landing. There's a variety of options, and there's a very good program that was launched last year through the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund called Future Flight Challenge. That program brings together different sorts of organizations to tackle how exactly this urban air mobility program, urban air mobility world can be brought together from a air traffic management perspective. How do these aircraft integrate with current aircraft in either segregated or coexisting airspaces? How the certification processes for these new types of aircraft would have to be to enable them to be certified and then have continued airworthiness. They look at the infrastructure requirements, not only on the ground, but much more important is the air infrastructure in terms of communications. If you have more aircraft on the air, you need to ensure that they're communicating effectively to remain safe, and just new business models. Urban air mobility do not need to be operated in the same way as airlines, and current operators do for the larger aircraft. We're looking at completely disruptive business models. We're talking about the sort of Uber style for the taxi businesses, but coming back into the urban air mobility. And I mentioned this future flight challenge in the UK, but there's similar concepts being developed and delivered in Europe and the US and elsewhere. So the community are looking very much in detail as to how this can be enabled and how it can be enabled in a sustainable way.
Yeah, well, thank you all for those really insightful things. There are many more questions that people would like to ask, but we are afraid of run out of time. You will be able to ask some of these questions to the panelists after this call in individual breakout rooms. There's one question that I think we can direct to Matt here and go, well, how do you join the New Professionals Forum? And yeah, how do we go around and getting involved?
Great, thanks, Hannah. I definitely feel underqualified if you're asking a question at me compared to the depth of knowledge we have on our panelists today. But yeah, if you'd like to join the New Professionals Forum and stay connected with us, we have a LinkedIn group which you can find. We're also looking to launch a LinkedIn page which should be more transparent to give better visibility of events and things that are going on in the future. If you go on the ADS website, you can find the New Professionals Hub, where there's some blogs in the past, and certainly there's been plenty of food for thought from today's session that we'd love to sort of put, and maybe we could do a write-up of what we've learnt today. Likewise, there's some future events coming on. We've got a virtual innovation event on the 16th of September, so stay connected to find out more. And we've also got our annual conference in November, the date TBC. As I said, if you follow us on LinkedIn, then you'll be the first to hear of when that is sorted. Finally, we're part of Farnborough Friday and Farnborough Connect today. There's loads of great material. I've really enjoyed some of the sessions through the week, and there's a really exciting program today. So do check that out as well. All it remains for me to say is thank you very much to our panelists. I've found it really interesting. I've learnt lots. If you'd like to ask your questions to a panelist, if you'd like to know more about the MPF, if you'd like to spend a bit of time networking, I really recommend our breakout rooms. They should be down below in the Farnborough Connect portal. There'll be one for each panelist. I've also put the IDs on screen. So I will see you in those breakout rooms in a minute. Thank you very much.